Good evening, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that, of course, I would talk about my little fight review of the Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas fight. And I thought, of course, that I would congratulate Mr. Errol Spence Jr. on pretty much laying a hell of an ass whooping on that of Yordenis Ugas. And of course, for those of you that did not hear the results, that did not hear over what ended up happening in this fight, Errol Spence Jr., of course, not a shock to me, did end up winning this fight. But what I will say is this: I do have to give him a little bit of extra credit because I did not think that Errol Spence Jr. actually was going to get the knockout. I can't say that I'm necessarily shell shocked that a knockout happened. It's just that Errol Spence Jr., at least from what he's shown me in that of the welterweight division against the natural more talented welterweight so far, that he usually isn't going to knock one out unless they're a little bit more wore down, like that of a Kell Brook, someone who suffered a knockout in his last fight against Gennady Golovkin before they fought. But Errol Spence Jr., to be quite honest with you, this might be the best performance that he has had within a few years. And that's not me necessarily insulting Errol Spence's, skill set or anything like that. I just think all in all that not only was Errol Spence Jr., not only was he highly prepared for this fight, not only did it look like he had a great camp with his conditioning and also his strategy when it came down to it, but I believe that Yordenis Ugas, to be quite honest with you, even though I do think that he's a very decent technical fighter and I think that he's a person that is not a bad fighter whatsoever, I just don't know if he's on the same level necessarily as that of a Sean Showtime Porter. Even though a few years ago when they did fight, I do believe that Yordenis Ugas pulled out that fight, but just because a fighter may actually beat one fighter in one particular matchup doesn't always necessarily mean that they may be that of the greater or even more skilled fighter. They just may be that of a very tough matchup for that particular person. For example, we can take a look at Juan Manuel Marquez, and there may be a lot of people that would try to debate that Juan Manuel Marquez is greater than Manny Pacquiao, but for those of us that are logical and objective, we could actually never debate that. So it just is what it is, at least in my view, because Manny Pacquiao has accomplished so much more in his career. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, Yordenis Ugas, I do think all in all that he showed a lot of grit and a lot of guts, but it was very clear from early on after pretty much, those first couple of rounds that Errol Spence Jr. pretty much was going to pound this dude into submission. And Yordenis Ugas, he pretty much did exactly what I thought he was going to do. He pretty much was going to plod forward straight at Errol Spence Jr. and try to out-counter him. And kind of like Danny Garcia, like I said in my fight prediction, he's a person that relies a little bit too much on his counter-punching ability. Excuse me. And don't get me wrong, counter-punching ability is a great thing, but sometimes, as there may be certain people who say this, sometimes overall you need to box the fighter and fight the boxer. Basically, what does that mean? Let me put it overall in simpler terms. Basically, what that means is that Yordenis Ugas, he was going to have to throw a great amount of volume in this fight. He was going to have a lot of volume punches in this fight. He was going to have to be toe-to-toe somewhat with Errol Spence Jr., not always in terms of the strategy, but in terms, of the total amount of punches thrown. And Yordenis Ugas, excuse me, he's not necessarily a person that throws a great amount of punches. He's a person that is never known for really throwing punches in bunches. And that sometimes can be the difference overall between an all-time great fighter and a very decent fighter. Sometimes, even very good fighters, they don't know really overall when to turn it up a notch overall in that of the biggest fights. Errol Spence Jr., for example, he's one of those top 5 pound-for-pound fighters, in my opinion, or at least top 6 when it comes down to if you don't put him in your top 5 pound-for-pound. He's personally in my top 5 pound-for-pound even still. But at the end of the day, Errol Spence Jr., he's one of those guys that knows when he really needs to turn it up, even sometimes when he's in trouble. That's why he was able to win the Sean Porter fight. That's why overall he was able to win the Kell Brook fight. That's why he was able to win a couple of other fights that maybe were a little bit tougher than him overall, than maybe in certain moments than what he expected. Basically, what you call that, within someone is that they have that dog in them. And that's not me saying that Yordenis Ugas, that he doesn't have fight with him, that he doesn't have guts, but I think he knew overall from pretty early on that pretty much just like I predicted in my prediction, that Errol Spence Jr., that he was just going to be a little bit too athletic and a little bit too powerful to really handle throughout the whole entire time. And Yordenis Ugas, pretty much after those first 4 or 5 rounds, now he did have a slight moment in the 6th round where he did have Errol Spence Jr. a little bit hurt. Now, of course, certain people, of course, will say, well, there was a mouthpiece situation where Errol Spence Jr., he wasn't paying attention, and that's how he ended up getting hurt. Well, let's also, be a little bit real about this. Yordenis Ugas landed a hell of an uppercut. He did overall, get the mouthpiece out of Errol Spence Jr.'s mouth. He did hit a right hand where Errol Spence overall maybe seemed to be slightly distracted, but I full on believe that Yordenis Ugas, that he actually did have Errol Spence Jr. hurt for a time. But I just think that Yordenis Ugas, when it came down to it, I just think that personally that he was feeling the power of Errol Spence's punches too much. and that's pretty much what I predicted. Or Yordenis Ugas and Errol Spence Jr., they fight very similarly. They pretty much try to go forward and break their opponents down. They're both very decently technical. And when you have two fighters overall that are like that, you're going to have a very difficult fight for one of the fighters. And the reason why that is because they just fight so similarly. So more than likely, the more talented, the more intelligent fighter, the fighter that overall knows how to turn it up another notch compared to that of the other fighter, they're more than likely going to win that fight. And not only are they more than likely going to win that fight, but they're more than likely going to win that fight by domination, at least somewhat. Well, it depends overall what the levels are. There are certain fighters overall to where they've had similar styles to where the fight was very, very competitive. Like that maybe of a Tommy Hearns and a Sugar Ray Leonard. Two fighters all in all that sometimes would prefer to be a little bit on the back foot, could be offensive when possible, but somewhat of boxer punchers. There was the Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus Zab Judah fight. Now, Floyd Mayweather Jr., of course, in my view, is way more skilled and overall way better under pressure than what Zab Judah ever was. But in the first half of that fight, especially, it was a very, very difficult fight for Floyd Mayweather Jr. because Zab Judah overall was very quick on his feet. He was a very decent athlete. He was a person all in all that was a very decent counter puncher, at least for the first half of the fight. And then he pretty much mentally would break down almost every single time, after the first 5 or 6 rounds. But anyways, when it came down to this fight, I thought that Yordenis Ugas, I thought all in all that he showed a great amount of heart, but I really overall can't give you a whole lot of credit overall for just showing a great amount of heart. Pretty much Yordenis Ugas showed that he pretty much overall was the inferior fighter to that of Errol Spence Jr. in almost every single category. Athleticism, footwork when it came down to it, movement, pretty much in almost every area. And Yordenis Ugas, I said in order for him to beat Errol Spence Jr. that he pretty much overall would have to do 3 things. That A, he would have to take control of the ring, which he tried early on, but he just was not successful enough later on because he was not willing to exchange and go to war with Errol Spence Jr. at least a little bit here and there. And that's not me saying that you want to stand in the middle of the ring with Errol Spence Jr. the whole entire time because he's a person all in all that's very good on the inside. He's very good in whatever dimension that he's going to be fighting in. So Errol Spence Jr., and on top of that, he has very, very, very extraordinary power overall for the welterweight division. Very good power. So he's not just a person that you want to stand in the middle of the ring with and overall pretty much just always go blow for blow. But that leads me overall to my next point. Yordenis Ugas, in order to beat Errol Spence Jr., in my view, he was going to have very quick feet. And Yordenis Ugas, he's never been known for having quick feet. He's never been known for having quick feet. He's never really utilized his footwork overall to the best of his ability. What Yordenis Ugas is, he pretty much is a pressure fighter that's pretty much going to try to come forward and break you down. And if you are able to push him back, he is overall going to have a little bit of a difficulty. Not saying that he can't fight on the back foot necessarily, but he prefers to fight on the front foot. And if you are able to back him up, which is what Errol Spence Jr. a lot of the times was able to do in this fight, he gets visibly uncomfortable. He does not have the quickest feet when it comes down to it. He does not throw a lot of punches. And that was going to lead to his loss, in my opinion, his eventual demise in this fight. And that's pretty much what happened. So this fight overall pretty much, happened just kind of like what I predicted. I overall am a little bit slightly surprised, overall, pleasantly surprised that Errol Spence Jr. was able to get the knockout. But am I shell-shocked? No, I'm not shell-shocked. Because I don't think that Yordenis Ugas, I don't think that he's the fighter, and I really don't think overall that he's the athlete like that of a Sean Porter or a Danny Garcia, even that really of what a Kell Brook was at that point in time when Errol Spence Jr. fought him. Now, pretty much overall, that pretty much is the whole fight review. The big question is now, of course, is when is that Terrence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight potentially going to happen? And is it even potentially going to happen? What we don't necessarily know as of yet, Errol Spence Jr., and I did see him overall in his post-fight interview, he said that overall that he is interested in that Terrence Bud Crawford fight and that he is coming for that belt. We'll see. I'll know whether Errol Spence Jr. overall, whether he is telling the truth or not. We'll see. I've never overall really been a person that has alleged that Errol Spence Jr. has avoided Terrence Bud Crawford because I think that if Crawford ever was really, really, truly 100% serious in facing that of an Errol Spence Jr. in the first place, I think all in all that he could have signed with the PBC where pretty much all the other big boy welterweights were anyway. But it is what it is. Anyways, but Terrence Bud Crawford, it seems that he finally has realized that maybe the best thing to do is to leave that of Top Rank. We don't really know who he's going to face next. It could be maybe Errol Spence Jr. straight away. It could maybe be that of a Keith Thurman or a Danny Garcia. Personally, I would probably like to see maybe Terrence Bud Crawford face out of a Keith Thurman. I think all in all that would be a very decent fight, especially since Keith Thurman, he had a very decent performance over Mario Barrios. Sure, he didn't get the stoppage, but all in all, Keith Thurman, he does only have that one loss in his career. It is the only elite welterweight that Errol Spence Jr. has not fought as of yet. Because if you go on to face Danny Garcia, even though I don't think that it's a bad fight, that's pretty much going to be looked at as an Errol Spence Jr. leftover. Now, not every leftover is a person that is just a bum or someone that is completely washed up. I don't see Danny Garcia as being someone that's completely washed up. However, what I will say is that I think that a Keith Thurman fight would be better for Terence Bud Crawford's career. But anyways, just jumping overall into that fight, if this fight does happen, which I truly hope that it does, because I think that it is a humongous fight, and the winner of the Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Bud Crawford fight, even though I pretty much have Canelo Alvarez locked as my number one pound for pound fighter at the current moment in time, if Terence Bud Crawford especially wins that fight because he is a three-weight division champion, and if he were to unify the welterweight division in completion, then overall he would have to be at least debatably in that number one pound for pound conversation. If Errol Spence Jr. were able to defeat that of Terence Bud Crawford, he would be somewhat in that conversation, but I think all in all there would probably be less of an argument for him just because he's only a one-weight division champion. But of course, that doesn't mean all in all that maybe he would not at least deserve to be mentioned in the conversation. But we'll see all in all what happens. But anyways, it's going to be very particularly interesting. If you're asking me overall personally who do I think would win the fight, I would have to go with Terence Bud Crawford, but I think it's a 60-40 fight, and to be quite honest with you, one certainly could still debate that it's still a 50-50 fight. Both Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., I think they both bring something to the table that may frustrate one another, but the thing that I see from Terence Bud Crawford, in my view, that is going to give Errol Spence Jr. more problems overall than vice versa, is that I think Terence Bud Crawford has that quick feet, and I think all in all that not only does he have around the same amount of power as that of an Errol Spence Jr., or at least debatably, or enough power to somewhat keep him off of him, but I think he has that movement, that footwork when it comes down to go in and out. I think that he has that dog in him. I think he has that boxing fight IQ and that adaptability to know when to turn it up to another degree. And that's what Yordenis Ugas was missing. Yordenis Ugas was missing the adaptability, and he was missing the boxing IQ, all in all, to basically say, you know what, I need to turn this up another notch. If I'm going to survive in this fight, I need to exchange with Errol Spence Jr. a little bit here and there, or learn how to counter him a little bit better. I need to use my feet a little bit. Sometimes I will have to push him back, but other times I'm also going to have to use my feet to get in and out. Yordenis Ugas, pretty much what he did is that he pretty much plotted backwards when it came down to it overall, pretty much just trying to survive, absorbing certain shots on the inside, trying to defend it the best he could, and then overall back to praying overall that Errol Spence Jr. wasn't going to hit him immediately with a decent combination. And Terence Bud Crawford, he's not overall just going to be as slow. His feet are nowhere near overall as slow as what a Yordenis Ugas is. Terence Crawford has very quick feet. He has very decent feet, but what I will say about Terence Crawford is this. He does tend overall to get hit a little bit more than what I would like him to. But maybe one could say that for Errol Spence Jr. as well. It's going to be very interesting to see if that fight happens, who is potentially going to win that fight. Because Terence Crawford, in my opinion, the advantages that he has, in my view, he has the advantages in most categories over Errol Spence Jr. But what Errol Spence Jr. has the advantage in my opinion, is power. He also has the advantage in chin, in my opinion. One may even debate that he has the slight advantage in slight defense, even though Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, they will get hit with certain shots here and there. But it is what it is. Anyways, it's going to be very particularly interesting to see what happens in the future. But anyways, hopefully we get to see this Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence fight this year. That would be a humongous fight. I would personally love to see that fight. Of course, that is a fight overall pretty much between two of the most talented fighters in the world. So we'll see all in all what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. But congratulations to Mr. Errol Spence Jr. This fight overall pretty much was exactly, not 100% exactly like I predicted, because of course I thought that this was going to decision. But I'm not really surprised overall that it ended in a 10th round stoppage either, because Yordenis Ugas' eye pretty much was completely closed. So it is what it is. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later. And of course, I do apologize all in all for not posting as much this week. I just thought that I would take a little bit of a break. But I will be talking more next week. Not only maybe a little bit about Canelo Alvarez, but also, of course, about Mr. Tyson Fury and Dillian White. Maybe that of Terence Bud Crawford, and a few others as well. Because, of course, we have some very, very decent fights overall upcoming. Next week, of course, we have Tyson Fury versus Dillian White. Then the week after that, Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez, as well as Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano, probably the biggest women's boxing fight in boxing history. And then, of course, overall after that, you have Canelo Alvarez versus Dimitri Bivol. So we have a very, very, very great setup for a great amount of fights. So we'll see all know what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.